Two. Hi, everyone. We'll be starting in just a minute, and a request for you to put your mic on mute, and we'll be getting started in just a little bit. Thank you. All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's so wonderful to see all of you out here tonight. I want to share a warm appreciation for you joining us for reading Audre Lorde in Community, which is being recorded and also live streamed on YouTube. This is the third of 7 online public events for the November through January residency, Radiating Black Puerto Rican Feminist Studies from the City University of New York to the Americas and the Caribbean, being coordinated with the Brooklyn Community Center and Library, Wendy's Subway, also with support for the CUNY Graduate Center's Lost and Found CUNY Poetics Document Initiative with the Center for the Humanities and the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. Also Brooklyn College's Wolf Institute for the Humanities, the Africana Studies Department, the American Studies Program, and the Puerto Rican and Latino Studies Department, and also City College of New York's Latin American and Latino Studies Program. My name is Conor Tomás Reed. I also go by Coco, and I welcome all pronouns. I currently teach at Brooklyn College in the City University of New York, and I organize with Free CUNY and Rank and File Action. I wish to thank tonight's roundtable participants, Nema Ali, Joy Gutierrez, Suzanne Herrera Lipuma, Jillian White, and T.D. Wilkins. Also the Wendy's Subway team, in particular, Sunny and Carlos, and all of you for joining us for this really beautiful event. And I invite everyone to share in the chat where you're connecting from so we can learn how far and wide that we're reaching towards each other. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm reaching to you from the homeland of the Lenape and Canarsie people, which is and always has been a place of Indigenous movement. Our work today and ongoing at its most fundamental level is in solidarity with the Lenape, Canarsie, and all Indigenous people here and beyond, whose land was stolen to create settler states and who continue to live under siege, surveillance, and colonial structural violence on their own occupied land. We align with all of those advancing Indigenous resurgence and decolonization in the face of colonial oppression. We support the return of their lands. This acknowledgement is a call to commit and to take on the responsibility to dismantle the ongoing effects of settler colonialism. This is where together we must begin and persist. The Audre Lorde reading group that we'll be speaking about tonight is one persisting kinship vision. Jillian White and I co-facilitated its emergence across 4 sessions from mid-October to mid-November 2019 at the City University of New York. We had an Audre Lorde reading group call for participation, which will be posted in the chat. In the invitation, we expressly centered the participation of people of colors, specifically women, gender non-binary, and LGBTQ people. We also encouraged people who usually had access to these kinds of study spaces to pass along the invitation more broadly. And finally, we urged participants to create further reading groups coming out of this one. We shared the Audre Lorde reading groups, which will also be posted in the chat. We began the first week with Lorde's late 1970s works, A Litany for Survival, Poetry is Not a Luxury, and The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. Then we moved backwards in time to Lorde's late 1960s to mid-1970s CUNY teaching archives, which were published in the Lost and Found chapbook, I Teach Myself in Outline, edited by Miriam Atkin and Imanja Brown. And we'll make sure to put the link to the Lost and Found chapbook in the chat. Then our third session paired her essays on uses of the erotic and uses of anger, along with the poem Power and her 1984 conversation with James Baldwin. We concluded the fourth week by delving into Lorde's contributions to identity politics and intersectionality, as well as her opposition to colonialism and imperialism, with the essays Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference, and Grenada Revisited, an interim report. I cannot emphasize enough how profound these weekly gatherings were. One account of our process by a participant, Spencer Garcia, captures these transformative connections that Lorde's legacy nourished in us each week, and we'll share that in the chat as well. Since then, several of us have continued to read Lorde, as well as the works of Randall Keenan, Gloria Anzaldúa, Jean Marquard, and beyond. It has been a tremendous joy in this life to think, feel, and act alongside these brilliant, soul-expanding friends, and to have more from the group who are among us here tonight. So I'll now read the bios of who you'll get to hear from, and then we'll hear from them in this order, followed by ample time for questions and answers and dialogue for around the second half of this event. Jillian Lane White is an Afro-Indigenous organizer and media maker living in Flatbush, Brooklyn, on occupied Lenape land. Her political and artistic identity has been greatly influenced by the works of queer feminists of color like Gloria Anzaldúa, Barbara Smith, and Audre Lorde, multidisciplinary creative documentarians like Zora Neale Hurston, and the many generations of ancestors and spirits that used their creativity to ensure our collective survival. Nema Ali is a Somali-American writer, educator, and law student. She studies at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and is focused on public interest law, immigration, and critical race theory. For the past 10 years, she has worked in education, food security, and family and parent organizing. She's interested in the power of joy, kinship, and non-hierarchical pedagogy in shaping imaginations and collective futures. She has loved learning and holding space with the Audre Lorde reading group since 2019. Joy Gutierrez is a queer Filipinx-American warrior, architect, and urban designer who grew up in Los Angeles and now lives and works in New York City. Joy works for the New York City Parks Department and is invested in the creation of collective and public space at the local level. They are also currently co-facilitating Buddhist meditation circles such as Queer Dharma, BIPOC Gathering, and the Anti-Race, Racism, Racial Inequality Meetup with the Shambhala Meditation Center of New York. Joy is deeply interested in the lived intersection of praxis and poetics as exemplified by Audre Lorde. How does one navigate and operate within the inherited systems and institutions of our daily life while speaking or writing, creating, dreaming our truths to realize meaningful change? Suzanne Herrera Lipuma is a Peruvian-American artist, teacher, and scholar, and recently completed a PhD at UC Berkeley in the Department of Rhetoric. She works on hemispheric arts in the Americas, critical theory, and feminisms of the global South. Her scholarly and art practices attempt precarious modes of seeing and non-seeing with ternura. She is interested in how decolonized feminist mark-making practices might be embodied, particularly the experience of speaking within zones of near silence. She has contributed writings to Kiparl and Paradoxa and the Contemporary Print Handbook. She has deeply appreciated reading and sharing with the Audre Lorde Reading Group since 2019. And finally, T.D. Wilkins is a Black lesbian educator, collaborator, college access and student retention advocate for LGBTQIA+ identified youth, girls, young women, and students of color. She earned an Ed.D. at Duquesne University, an MA at Teachers College, Columbia University, and her stripes, quote unquote, from the communities, parents, and students of New York City public schools after 12 years of service. T has worked with and taught students in colleges and universities in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and is currently an adjunct assistant professor at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. Her interests include the spectrum of Black female masculinities in reshaping Black women magic, female masculine love, marriage and motherhood dynamics, and the joy of being a new wife to Sari D. Rottenberg. So now we'll get to hear from Jillian, then Nema, then Joy, then Suzanne, and then T, and then we'll come back together. Jillian, please take it away.
First, I want to start by thanking you, Connor, for the invitation to speak tonight, but also to co-facilitate with you. I guess I'll start from that moment when Connor asked me if I would be interested in co-facilitating an Audre Lorde reading group. I was excited. I was definitely excited about that prospect because I have long loved Audre Lorde, and I'm a huge nerd. I really love reading groups. Reading groups are actually just like one of my favorite things in the world. But I also felt really intimidated by that offer. It was intimidating for me as someone who does not spend time in academia to think about facilitating something that would be housed at CUNY. It was intimidating to think about co-facilitating with someone who is an academic, is like quite skilled in that world. And also just like confronting, like what are our ideas about like who has the authority to host things, who has the authority to like speak on a subject, and this like notion of expertise. And so I definitely was feeling like, well, I have no expertise in this. I just have a love of reading, a love of Audre, and just being in spaces with people. But pushed through that feeling. And that was largely due to the conversations that Connor and I had about how we imagined the space could be. So the first step for me was letting go of this assumption of expertise and to lean more into like, what would it be like for us to co-create a space with the participants? It's our responsibility to hold the logistics of the space. It's our responsibility to be forward thinking and to facilitate, but it's not our responsibility to control, to dictate where the conversation goes, or even really fully the subject matter. We chose some text, but we collectively were choosing what we were reading and how we were putting things together. So that took a lot of pressure off and also made me personally feel more at home with this idea. And another thing that we spent like quite a bit of time talking about was sort of like the current popularity of Audre Lorde in a social media context. I find it like I love seeing graphics of Audre Lorde pop up. I love seeing like beautiful illustrations of her, photos of her. It definitely brightens my day when I'm on Instagram and I see like her poems circulating, but there's also this way in which she becomes disembodied. She becomes decontextualized. So we talked a lot about that. We talked about the way in which many people actually don't know of like Audre's career and the expansive amount of work that she did in her lifetime. There's like, I feel like Litany for Survival is a piece of her work that just really gets broken apart and shared in bits and pieces. And it's powerful in those bits and pieces, but it doesn't do justice to her fullness. And so, yeah, we talked a lot about that. And we also talked about how in our recruitment, we also didn't want to like turn it into like, this is an exclusive club and like only XYZ people are like suitable to be in this group to like talk about Audre, and like, here's how we're going to talk about it. And if you can't get to this level, like you're not welcome. So we spent a bit of time discussing that. Some of it was productive. Some of it maybe was like a little shady at times on my end. But again, that's like me also confronting, right? Like my defensiveness around like, what do I have the authority to talk about, and other experiences that I've had in joining like study groups. New York is a very wonderful place, and also we do have elitist tendencies in our political spaces and our art spaces. And so for me as a facilitator, it was important to like unpack some of that. And yeah, another aspect of this that was pretty interesting for me, and I talked to Conor about this before we got started, which is just that like I was introduced to Audre Lorde during undergrad. I went to a small East Coast liberal arts college, and my introduction to Audre really like formally came during a class on Black feminisms and praxis, and for many reasons, I thought that class was going to be home for me. I thought that I was going to like see myself thoroughly reflected, and I was going to feel very comfortable there. And it actually was like stands out to me as like the worst academic experience that I had in undergrad. And I don't need to unpack all of that here. I have done that in therapy. But what I'll say about it is that it was a space that wasn't welcoming to all. It was a space that reserved Audre for some. And I say that also like within a context of Blackness. It was for some people to resonate with her experiences and not for others. It was definitely a space where I felt that, just my whole self couldn't be there. And I really wanted actively not to have that be repeated. And for me, it was like a space of really being able to show up with like my heart and just that like gut level at which like Audre's work resonated with me, and not that it wasn't an intellectual process that we had together, but that I could just say what I was feeling. I could say like, here's how I'm coming in this week, and here's how this week these words resonated with me. Not everything needed to be the world's most profound thing that someone could ever say about Audre Lorde. And that was just incredibly freeing, and it allowed me to like rewrite my story in relationship to, in particular, Sister Outsider. So one of the other things that we did was to create an altar, a community altar. And for me, that was another part of this like healing aspect, which was for us to regard the time that we had together as sacred, and to recognize that like this particular collection of people, it won't be repeated. And I can testify that it's like very hard for everyone to continue organizing times to meet up, right? Like we've never again actually had all like that same formation. So to really hold that time as sacred with each other, and to allow everyone, or for the invitation at least, to be there for people to show up in a wholehearted way. So for me, that was the framing, and that was how I entered the space, and what also really stood out to me as setting this particular reading group apart from the many other reading groups that I am also a part of.
Thank you, Jilly. Nema, please go ahead.
Okay, well, I also want to start by thanking Conor and Jilly for doing all of that labor to have the space and to invite all of us in. I really wanted to start with a reading of A Litany for Survival, which was the first thing that we read together a little over a year ago, and invite everybody on the call to be in community with us, reading Lorde again. So I will begin. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways, coming and going, and the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who are imprinted with fear like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not return. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. I may or may not cry, but I really, in thinking through like what I wanted to talk about and reflecting on the time together, I went through our emails and my journal, and I was telling Coco, I wrote everybody's names down, pronouns, and like people's favorite comfort food, because it was the first way we introduced ourselves to each other, like what brings you comfort in times or moments of need. And the other thing I found was that I wrote 3 questions down at the end of my notes. Who can I have principled struggle with? Who do I share vulnerable intimacy with? Who can weep and still be counted as warrior? And like Jilly, my first engagement with Audre was in undergrad at another liberal arts school, and it was in a queer theory class. And I remember thinking similarly, like this will be a way for me to learn how to think my way out of white heteropatriarchy, and that this is a teacher whose writing I really, really love. And it's true, like I loved Audre's writing for so long, and I do think it's interesting in the time that she was everywhere. I do really feel like 2019 was a kind of Audre's invitation to me to gather myself. Like so many people sent me the questionnaire. I read Pleasure Activism. It starts with the uses of the erotic, and then to see this call for a reading group, and I had really successful reading groups in the past, felt like kind of meant to be. And my gut was like, oh, this is for you. Write this out. And I'm really, really grateful to that time all of us had together. I felt the real reorienting to a more felt understanding of her words, because we were able to grapple together through the text, right? And it's one thing to like intellectualize and read it at home by myself or in an academic setting, and it's another thing to be in community with 15 people who are bringing their whole selves. And one of the most special things I thought about the reading group was that we started with like a 30-minute check-in, and there was always laughter, there was always heaviness, and people really opened their interior lives in a way that wasn't. Audre says this thing in the uses of the erotic, like the use of someone else's feeling, like as a Kleenex is abuse. But I really felt like the safest I felt in a long time in a reading group where I could share so openly and be so vulnerable and talk about what was happening at work or in my interpersonal life, and have it grounded in the text and have it grounded in community. The other thing I wanted to say was that one of the more profound things that happened was that we began to become friends outside of this reading group. Like we would have wine together, or we would I would take the train back to Brooklyn with a few people, or we would congregate afterward. And it went beyond the text to a community of folks who wanted to reorient from scarcity to a way of thinking about life that centered joy and action, and community. And what does it mean to be, in principle, to struggle with people? Who can I share vulnerable intimacy with? Who can weep and still be counted as a warrior? And I think being in community was powerful as a lesson to see what it was like, but it was so powerful to me to see what it meant for me to sit in all of my feelings and to be okay with being emotional at work, because it is powerful and it is a function of power and it is a deep, deep knowing, and to see it mirrored back to me in community was really, really special. And I hold everybody with so much love, and I hold that time with so much holiness almost for what it offered me in my continual pursuit of joy and freedom.
Thank you so much, Nema. Joy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Coco. Thank you, Conor and Jillian, for inviting me into the space, and Conor for having me on this talk tonight. It's really just so wonderful to share our collective experience and my own personal experience. So I feel like I've had several layers of relating to Audre's writings. And so when I received the invitation to join this group last year, it was just sort of a blessing. And I think it's a testament to Conor and Jillian about how they created this wonderful container, because there was this initial email that went out that asked us to sort of agree to certain things about the group, like, centering Black women's voices, and it was sort of like a community understanding. And then I think also, like Jillian mentioned, the community altar, that just made that time so special. And then the food was, people brought food at every meeting, and it was just so good. And we'd be like munching away and talking and laughing and then crying, and then we'd get up for dessert. So it was, there was just so much like hearth and heart. And I felt like I could just bring all the parts of myself, as Nema said. So I think for me, that's the biggest thing with Audre, just, continually throughout the strands of my life, is to continually come home to yourself, to your truest self. And I think litany for survival and uses of anger. I'll always remember T saying, when we were talking about that reading, you might as well bring it, because you were never meant to survive. So you might as well just speak up. And I think Audre is her writing, her poetry, the way she lived her life is just always that calling, you know, to come back to that. And so when I was, the other thing is that I don't think anyone in my life has been experienced with an altar in a very like secular realm, except for Audre. When I was an undergraduate in college, that was when she had passed away. So I'm kind of dating myself. And there was an altar and a vigil, and that was at Berkeley, and it was in, you know, one of the biggest liberal arts buildings, and there it was, and there was a candle, and there were photos, and then fast forward to just last year, like, you know, running around this city like crazy. Also for me, you know, being in academia is a little bit out of my wheelhouse as well. But to go into that room at the Graduate Center and see the community altar was just sort of like, you know, there's something sacred about what Audre invites us into. And so when I felt like there are two parts to my relation to Audre's writings. When I moved to New York around, I guess, 99, and I didn't know anybody here, I didn't have a job, and I was living out in Brooklyn, and I was just feeling alone and very isolated, and I didn't quite know, like, why would I up and leave my family of origin, who's like in Los Angeles. And I just felt very, very, yeah, just sort of alone. And so I came across Zami, the new spelling of my name. And in it, you know, she talks about her life in, you know, starting in Harlem, and, you know, moving out to Brighton Beach. And that's the part in the book that really resonated with me, because like that was a struggling time for her. And then, you know, her time in the village, and, you know, even just working in Connecticut. And so, yeah, I think the way that she just lived her life invited me to put down, you know, my roots, and, you know, do that with a kind of like agency and, you know, a sense of adventure, and really how do you create community where you are? How do you begin to put that down? And so I felt like that was really, really special and helpful for me, especially during that time. And then, so fast forward, you know, when we joined the reading group, I didn't know too much about her career at CUNY, and the chapbook that Conor and the CUNY Lost and Found that we, you know, read together within the group really was like illuminating to me. It was sort of like looking into how her thought process was in working as a teacher and a poet. And also, I think what resonated for me was that she was working within this large institution, which is CUNY, and it has like all of this hierarchy, and yet she was swimming in that and still able to bring her own, you know, real truth continually. And so I love this one. I'll read this one quote from the chapbook. It's from a note on the texts. And it's a piece from her essay, Poet as Teacher, Human as Poet, Teacher as Human. Lorde says, I am a human being. I am a Black woman, a poet, mother, lover, teacher, friend, fat, shy, generous, loyal, crotchety. If I do not bring all of who I am to whatever I do, then I bring nothing, or nothing of lasting worth, for I have withheld my essence. And so, yeah, I think, you know, just for me, navigating, working within a big, you know, city agency and all the kinds of hierarchies that are there, I think she, like reading her notes on students and her outlines and her thought process, it's very revealing. And I love, there's also a line where a student says, she always spoke with you as if, you know, she didn't want to be anywhere else except speaking with you. And I'm just thinking about how, you know, she taught at John Jay College to, you know, many cops. And it was about like racism. I can't imagine her, you know, like during that time in the early 80s, having those kinds of conversations and how much emotional labor she put in for that. And yet she did, and she, you know, and she thrived, I think, in terms of, you know, her poetry and her writing. And I think the other thing is that, you know, she always did what she did, I think, with intentionality. Like she had a family, and she, you know, had the house in Staten Island, and that was a, you know, a very deliberate choice to move there and raise her family. And then, you know, this continual, I guess, chapters in her life of, you know, being in New York City, and then going to, you know, Berlin, and then eventually settling in St. Croix. I mean, I think it's just a continual unfolding of her life. And so every time I come back to her writings, it's just sort of like, oh, and then there was that, right? So yeah, I think I'm continually coming back to her. I could read Uses of Anger and Uses of the Erotic many times and find yet another layer that just resonates or speaks to me. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy. Suzanne, you've got the mic.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Coco, for the invitation, and to Coco and Jillian for all the work that you did. I can't remember quite how I found the call. It was in like a vast deep dive in the internet. It came to me. And as I read it, I was like, this is not a ordinary reading group. These voices are not ordinary voices. And yeah, and every kind of step along the way, as other people have mentioned, kept reinforcing that, you know, we got this very thoughtful email about what the group would mean. And I still remember filling out the questionnaire that, you know, every answer was like a potential long form answer. Even like, you know, it was like name, long form answer, like gender, long form answer. And so there were just all of these moments when you could tell that a certain kind of care was going into what you were about to enter. And I was coming to New York, where I had lived before, and I have some family on the East Coast, but I hadn't been really in New York for 10 years. And it was very disorienting to come back, and scary in certain ways, and be like, do I have to make friends all over again. Like, what do I do? I'm an adult now. And so, you know, at the same time, I had been thinking about wanting to read different kinds of decolonial and women of color and queer of color feminism in community and in a kind of space that wasn't just an academic one. I'm just at the end of my PhD from Berkeley, but one of the things, I wrote some notes because I get kind of nervous speaking, but I just, one of the things that struck me was just that, yeah, we were in this like incredibly trusting and real space. There was no posture and none of that like mediating front that comes up, and no like appropriating a text to turn it into an official knowledge that can be consumed or like laminated smoothly like an object, even with this like kind of weird reverence, but that pushes it out of really integrating it into your life. And so I really appreciated being in a space that was totally the opposite of that. And there's this question of like, how do these texts entwine with our lives, and how do they, what threads are they offering us, and like finding sustenance and that was already there and naming it, and then also finding new forms of sustenance, and also with each other. I'm kind of a visual person, so I just wanted to share a little bit about what it was like to physically be in the space. You had to take an elevator, and the days kept getting shorter because it was around this time of year, and it was usually dark by the time we met, and most people kind of were commuting from work or teaching, and people would bring dinner. And yes, Jillian and Coco devotedly brought these snacks every week, like lots of snacks, many snacks. And then other people started bringing, I remember there was a week of the jalapeno cornbread. That was a special week. And it was in this CUNY classroom that was very, you know, kind of cleanly appointed with dark blue carpet and walls, black laminate tables that were in a kind of C shape. And, you know, in some ways quite formal. And, but at the front, you know, to the side, there was this community altar with various objects. And Jillian and Coco had put on music. So there was this kind of welcoming into the space. And there was usually a picture of Audre, or sometimes like a short video of Audre reading at the beginning. And so we would have a kind of visual and sensory contact with Audre as we started and as the space opened. And it just, sometimes I would just kind of sit back and marvel and be like, wow, this is like one of the most institutional, like black laminate table rooms, and it doesn't feel that way. And you know, towards the end, we're all thinking about like, oh, what if we did this in houses? And you know, there's so many warm kind of alternatives, but really it was just a testament to how much everyone brought, and also how, you know, it was certainly no small feat for Jillian and Coco to hold like the logistics, but also hold those logistics were like a lot of care as well. There was a real esfuerza that I felt, and like there was a net holding us that Jillian and Coco really brought. So just I still, you know, just have so much gratitude towards that. So the group, as some people have mentioned, did continue on after, and different people still kind of come in and out. So we began rotating, you know, each of us would kind of suggest different pieces. And one way that we found to just not have too much work right at the beginning was like, well, let's just read Zami, and that'll like sustain us for many weeks. So we did that. And I just wanted to read some things from one week when one of our co-collaborators, Spencer, and I were bringing Zami to the group. We had the opening chapters, and I went back in these notes and I had forgotten that we had pulled these quotes. Zami opens with a series of questions, and the first two questions are, to whom do I owe the power behind my voice? What strength I have become? And the second question is, to whom do I owe the symbols of survival? And so I think, we asked the group to kind of consider those in our opening discussion of Zami. And I think those questions have really been present in our readings and how we move, move through. Sorry, my notes were not complete. The first one is, to whom do I owe the power behind my voice? What strength I have become, yeasting up like sudden blood from under the bruised skin's blister. And part of where the first chapter of Zami took us is to Kariaku. And there was just one other passage that kind of has stayed with me. And I have family in Peru, and so home being in many places and present and absent is something I think about a lot. And so Audrey's talking about how Kariaku had not been listed in like the gazettes or indexes in the school maps. And so she writes, but underneath it all, as I was growing up, home was still a sweet place somewhere else, which they had not managed to capture yet on paper, not to throttle and bind up between the pages of a school book. It was our own, my truly private paradise of bulgur and breadfruit hanging from the trees, of nutmeg and lime and sapadilla, of tonka beans and red and yellow paradise plums. And I think that in that passage and all throughout Zemi, I felt like we were constantly receiving these riches of details of Audrey's life. Someone, I can't remember now, maybe Jillian was saying like that Audrey can become decontextualized, and that there was just, for me, so much joy and meaning in following along with Audrey more closely in a very concrete space and time, and even the faraway places where came in these very kind of dense sensory images that were given to us. So, yeah.
Thank you, Suzanne. Teeth, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm unmuted and folks can hear me. Okay, good. I don't use Zoom often, and it's very weird to come back to it after being consumed in the Blackboard machine all day, like the Matrix. So I think there are many things I remember, and many things that I remember that I've been extremely moved by being part of this group. In the beginning, I think the first couple of things that struck me was the process of joining the group, what we were asked to do. And I hear these beautiful kind of memories about wanting the space to have a certain kind of feeling where it was non-academic, and there were kind of ways in which people would engage each other with the readings. And all of that is true. However, I think it has to be said that Coco and Jillian really were very protective of this space. It was just like, look, not that it was ever communicated in that way, but these two folks were very intentional about what they wanted the space to mean to people, and not just to come and sit down and read this amazing work from Miss Audre, but the questions, the questionnaire that you had to fill out. I remember feeling like I was like filling out a job application. I wasn't sure, like, is there an interview? And then, you know, but the response to what I submitted was just, and you never see these people until you actually get there. It was just so inviting and so open. That, you know, initially I was a little afraid to go. Had gotten the information from a couple of other friends who said, you know, T, you might really enjoy this. And, you know, I went with no real expectations outside of reading this work, this body of work, and left with so many other things that I had not planned on happening at all. I think another thing that really strikes me about this group is, I don't know if anybody recognized this, and it's probably not very important, but I oftentimes would sit and feel as though, I think in the beginning, as the older person in the room that had a little bit more gray here and here, that, you know, I didn't sit in my undergraduate classes and discuss Black feminism and queer theory. We didn't do all that when I was an undergrad. Those classes were not offered. And we certainly had no Black studies, no Latinx, no nothing of people of color. We just had the classics. I was an English major, and I loved it. And I learned how to actually read in college, that, you know, writers wrote to tell stories to you so that you could discover them as you read them. And I had some fabulous teachers, but yeah, we didn't have these wonderful things that, you know, folks in the group were talking about. It's like, yeah, my college, and, you know, we just deconstructed and all this other stuff. And I'm like, okay, I know what these words mean, and I know what it means to do that when you read it. I mean, I teach a lot of the same things, but I don't remember doing that when I was in college. And I didn't do that actually until I got to graduate school. And even then, we didn't really read with this kind of foundational understanding of how we would apply Ms. Audre's work. It wasn't until my doctorate program where I started using Sister Outsider in my own writing that I really kind of had an understanding of what it was that this amazing individual was doing and was contributing to this movement. A lot of folks don't know that when I think the one of the first Black queer conferences that CUNY held, I remember going. I snuck in, I volunteered, and so all this stuff that now people kind of revere and hold up, and it's part of my undergraduate classes, and we talk about this and that. I just remember being there, like poking my head in, and I was there at that conference, or, you know, I witnessed and grew up with these folks who are now these amazing artists. So I think the thing that really resonated with me in terms of Audre Lorde, outside of the fact that she was a Black woman, a Black lesbian woman, and a poet, she was also a teacher. You know, for me, not just in the classroom, she was an educator first, and she taught through these many different ways through her work in social justice, but then also in her poetry, but also in the classroom. That was big for me. And so I found myself actually trying to say, like, me and Miss Audre seem kind of similar. Like, you know, I'm this age, and, you know, I don't have that writing talent, but I do teach. And there are things that she talks about in her teaching that when we were given the copies, by the way, everything that we read, they provided copies for us to have and hold in our hands. And, you know, the things that were just really long that we needed to be able to read together, those were the actual copies. But we had hardcover books. We got the pieces that we were able to keep, looking at Audre Lorde's teaching. But I looked at a particular section that we started to talk about one night, and I mean, I have notes all over it. It's real messy, and I just like, I was feeling stuff and scribbling it down real hard, and the ink is like smeared off. And so there's a section here that says, the learning process is something you can incite, literally incite, like a riot. And then just possibly, hopefully, it goes home or on. This incitement helps to dissolve the boundaries between the classroom and the streets, raising the stakes of learning to a question of survival. And so I think when we talk about undergraduate classrooms and we talk about you know, what it was like at my college or where I went and what I learned and what experience I had, I really feel like I have these conversations with people and not just students, but with people. And I learn this stuff on the streets, when I'm on the way to the grocery store, or at one point when I was waiting for the train or the bus, and you know, sitting next to a lady pulling her grandkids and heading home. It's cold. You know, we're doing Audre Lorde. We're not reading necessarily, learning, whatever, but we're doing Audre Lorde. And so we're taking this piece of what we worked with, what we kind of ingested, and we're kind of making it into verb form, which you do with words that, you know, it's become this thing today. But, you know, we're doing Lorde, we're doing Audre Lorde every single day. We're not meant to survive. I resonated with all of that. I understood what she was saying, not in such a way that says, you know, I'm complaining about something, but you know, the reality is in CUNY, where I teach, where I live, all of this stuff, you know, I was not meant to be here. And I needed to sit for a minute and think about what she was actually saying to me. And I think all of us in doing Audre Lorde, that's what we each did. As we read and shared and reflected, we were each hearing what she was speaking to each of us individually and then sharing that out with everybody else. I think the best thing I came away from participating in this group, hoping to maybe find friends with folks who barely half my age or a little bit more of my age, and sometimes just feeling like, okay, I'm tired, y'all. And then other times I'm just like, yes, I'm so happy y'all are here. And I had all these wonderful people crammed into my teeny tiny little house for Thanksgiving dinner in Brooklyn. And if y'all know me, if you've been in my house, it's real little, you know, chairs sitting next to each other, on top of each other. And we had a table by the window. It was hot in there. And people sat and ate food and laughed and drank and read, of course, Audre. And you know, it was a last minute thing. I didn't intend to do it, but I just said, okay, Audre Lorde folks, y'all want to come on, get something to eat. And I imagine again, of course, Coco saying, well, Audre Lorde loved lavish parties. You know, everybody bring a plate or come up, show up and be prepared to get yourself a plate, fix yourself a plate. And that's what we did everywhere. Little plates of snacks, little piece of Audre Lorde on the side, in the middle, you know, the centerpiece. And it got to a point where Audre Lorde started out as the centerpiece, and then the group became the bigger thing born of Audre Lorde's work. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for giving me the chance to join this group and participate and grow and learn in the streets. I've never been an academic. I pretend to be one sometimes. But now I'm in a bigger house and I'm a wife, and you know, we're preparing to have a baby, and things have changed and through the eyes of this work. You know, I'm looking at myself changing and aging and becoming a parent. It's pretty fantastic. And I'm so glad that this was part of that experience. This is part of my growth. So thank you.
Oh my goodness. So everyone who is on this call, can't you see just a glimpse of the extraordinariness that was this reading group? And there were in total around 20 people who were a part of it during the fall of 2019. And so really these are just slices of the experience. I'm looking at the time, and I have selfishly a few questions, but I think I may pivot and actually expand out to welcome participants who are here in this event together to share some thoughts. I wonder if people who are tuning in, if you have some questions or reflections, some connections to make. And just as we had stated the intention for the reading group, we really want to center the voices of people of colors in this circle, and that's women and gender nonconforming and trans folk who are here with us. I also want to name that in addition to there being people from the Audre Lorde reading group who are in the audience, we also have some of Audrey's co-teachers in the CUNY system who are calling in tonight. And so I want to give a respectful recognition to Blanche Weisencook. And if anyone else wishes to share directly some experiences from your work with Audre Lorde, that's why we're here tonight. So I want to invite, if folks wish to make use of the chat to share a question or a thought in the chat, or if you wish to share some thoughts on the mic, then feel free to put your name in the chat just like I did. So let's get to hear from a couple of people, and then we can kick it back to the participants in the reading group who shared. So any questions or reflections so far that people wish to share? I see you, Violeta.
Thank you so much for this event. I think that, well, lately I'd been thinking about what you guys were mentioning regarding the importance of reading together, because especially when it comes to this kind of writing that is so important to share. And I guess I kind of wanted to open the question of why it's so hard to find this, not only to share that intimacy, but also a pained intimacy of sorts, and why it's important to not do it alone.
I'm hearing this question to get us started, and perhaps we can get to hear from a couple more folks from the audience. And the intention is for this to be informal, for us to really connect with each other tonight. So thinking
I
about,
wonder,
please go
Conor,
ahead.
I'm off camera because I'm actually recovering today. I had knee replacement surgery, but I'm just thrilled with this program, with your group, with your vision. And Audre was, of course, always about love, community, sharing, building a future for peace and justice and love. And your group is really a wonderful, creative part of that legacy. And I am so grateful and moved by the group and by every one of you and your splendid, splendid work. And Conor, I always think of you in terms of Jane Marcus. So hey, Audre Presente, Jane Presente.
Absolutely.
Hunter, the Graduate Center Presente. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Blanche. Thank you. And this is possibly now as good a time as any to share that there is a campaign at Hunter College to rename one of the Hunter College buildings, Hunter West, to rename it an Audre Lorde building. So I encourage folks to check out the link and to sign the petition that's circulating for that. The floor is open. If anyone wishes to share whether you've read Audre in community similarly, independently in more formal learning settings, or any reflections that people on the in the room may have about what the participants had shared about the reading group, the floor is open.
I'll share something. I've read a lot of Audre's earlier work, but not that much of her later work, especially when she's grappling with illness and mortality and vitality. And I'm wondering what kind of, especially in this moment where all these things are so imminent and fragile and on our minds, what you all have found in reading her later work, and also just thinking about her work in terms of illness and of disability and of death.
Thank you for that question, Sunny. I wonder if folks who had shared, if you may wish to reflect on Violetta's question about reading solo or in isolation, or reading in community, and thinking with Sunny's question about reading Audre in this presence of a pandemic, Audre Lorde writing about surviving, even thriving through living with cancer. If anyone has any thoughts. And don't be shy, y'all. We're just in community together. It's okay. ICUT, please go ahead.
I wanted to address part of, if I'm understanding the question correctly, because it was so good, Violetta's question, kind of the importance of reading as a group, why so important, and not topically, like, why is this such an important thing to do? Like, you know, why can't you just read by yourself? But what is so sustainable about something? What's important about that sustainability? Doing something where so many different people are coming together from jobs, tired, it's cold, raining. I remember one time we left in the rain, it was come down. And I think for me, I answered the question by looking at something that a student of mine shared. This is a brother who, obviously phenomenal student, amazing writer, hip hop artist, filmmaker, like he does it all. And he told me after COVID had hit and we were just starting to go into online classes, we met in office hours, and he told me to kind of share something about reading, what I have been doing, what's going on, just kind of like a real thirst for connection some sort of way through a video. And so I told him about the Audre Lorde group that I was a member of, and he was like, for real? That's dope. You know, professor, like, I think that sounds really great. And so when I met up with him again, like 2 weeks later, he had started his own group. And this was a men's group, a Black men's group. And I said, oh, okay, so what y'all talk about in there? He said, well, you know, it's you know, we want to respect people's privacy. I said, of course. And, you know, I was making suggestions of things that they could consider, or, you know, but he was telling me the things that they were talking about, and kind of this reconfiguring Black masculinity, and not just reading, because they weren't really reading anything. They were just really getting together and talking. I think that the importance of it is kind of like the different ways that this gathering is possible, the different ways in which, you know, you're not going to go out and change this and this and all these different things, but the different ways that a gathering of this becomes possible in food, in literature, in people, in company, in words, in talk, in sharing. And I think that it is really important, particularly for groups who don't engage enough in this way, to do it more often. And for me to hear that, you know, just a random guy in my class, random professor, you know, he sat down with, he told me, I think they had like 15 brothers, all Black men getting together. I was like, well, here, I shared a couple Audre pieces. Why don't you try that, see what happened? And I think he said they read one, but again, they can't talk about, it's a private group. So, but can you imagine that? I think in the Berlin piece, I'm sorry, the Berlin years, the film, of course, Conor helped me to get an opportunity to go and talk about this film where Audre Lorde is now in Germany, kind of supporting young people there with the Afro-German movement. She talked about engaging young Black men in her classrooms, and what that was like for her, and kind of how it became a way of kind of confrontational at first, but then it changed to something else. Just, you know, with a word that she used, her tone, she just changed a couple things, and he stopped looking at her as some Black dyke and suddenly was just like, oh, okay, let's engage in conversation. Different possibility of talk, different possibility of everything in that group, in a gathering like that. Sorry for the long answer.
No, my goodness, that's why we're here. I'm curious if anyone where there's this completely crowded community center, and someone is asking someone a tense question of the word, trying to minimize, trying to call together a sense of Black unity, in particular Afro-German unity, at the expense of talking about sexuality. And she's describing Lorde, you know, kind of while holding the microphone, is like reaching out for almost to bring him in to say, well, can we think about this together? And that seems like an incredibly different approach than sometimes what may feel like a more quick fix, but a more kind of disposable or excluding kind of gesture of political analysis in the present. Oh, I'm sorry. Would be great to hear from some more folks. Sorry about that if my internet's a little funny. And Sunny's question as well about thinking about reading Audre and her attention to health and being really public about her health issues in the present. I wonder if anyone has any reflections on that.
So for Violetta's first question about the like why it's so important to a reading community and how you go about getting to reading community. I've thought about this a lot because I've tried to make a bunch of reading groups unsuccessfully. And some of it is like friends I've cajoled to read something with me. But I did have a pretty powerful experience in Philadelphia called the Saturday Free School, where we read Baldwin and Du Bois for a little over a year. It was every Saturday from 10 to 2. And the thing that struck me the most about it was the commitment, right? Like we read out loud, so there was no one needed anything. You just had to show up, basically. And that was amazing. And then there was a core group of people, and some of them were on this call. And then afterwards, we would debrief this long session where we read for like an hour and a half and then talked about it and what it meant. And it was a powerful experience because it was really, everybody was there. It was not an academic space at all. People were sharing from very, very different experiences. And it was the first time I had to be in a reading group where I wasn't listening to respond. And I had to really unlearn how I was educated. Like I had to unlearn, I would be like, interesting, let me scribble this down. I'd be like, well, I actually think that just had to like go away. And we really sat with what people had to say. That's why it took so long. And you really couldn't interrupt people. And there was a guy that really irritated me in the beginning. And fast forward 5 months later, I was obsessed with him because he always made it back to the point, but he just took his whatever route that didn't feel like it had any connection. But by the end, I would be like, oh my God, you're like really, you're joining two things I would never, ever think to talk about. And it's because we offered the space not to interrupt anybody. That was really, really powerful. So I really do think it's just commitment and like figuring out how to do what Jillian and Coco did, which is curate a group. I hate to use that word, but like really be intentional about who you're inviting in and who you, from the way that you have the invitation out, who's going to respond to you. And then I wanted to, Sunny, I went to a Carolyn Lazard show like a couple of years ago, and we sat in a room and read the Cancer Diaries together. And it was really, really intense. And I hadn't super engaged with her her later works either. But the thing that was so amazing about it is that she still really, really is grounded in this idea of the erotic power, the inner deep knowing of what it means to be alive and what it means to choose survival, even when you're staring down your own mortality, which was really, really powerful and wild to just be like in a line of people. We're all sitting around, and at one point you're going to get the book, and then you have to read something, and people read as much or as little as they wanted. But I think I'm rambling, but I do think that reading her later works is really, really powerful, especially in kind of in concert with the videos. And I know there's a moment in the chat somebody asked about it, and I listened to her today to like mentally get in my zone for this panel. And her cadence is really amazing. And whenever she's talking to people, there's always laughter in the background because everybody's invited. Everybody is invited while she's reading an essay or she's reading a poem. And I do think that kind of expansive way of being present is like a gift. It's a real gift.
Could I?
Coming for folks. I see Jillian, I see Joy, I see Suzanne.
Yeah, can I just add to the question about Audrey's dealing with cancer and illness? I think Nema captured that so well. I think the other thing is that her children have also spoken eloquently about how, when I think she, I don't know how many episodes with cancer she had, but there were, several. And so I think her son described her as like, when she was in dealing with cancer at a certain time, that she, had an urgency to writing her poetry. And I think he described it as like, yeah, we would go to the grocery store and she would be sitting in the car, right, composing poems, and because there was no time to waste. And then I think her daughter talks about like how she had to navigate the healthcare system, and how that sort of was a lot, and as we can attest to now, and so yeah, I just think about how she was a mom and she was a teacher, and how just dealing with all of that and the frailty of life and the body. I felt like in the cancer journals, she was sort of like, also speaking about her body, which I think, is so important. And then I think the other thing was in the documentary or the movie, Berlin, the cancer years, like many have said that time in her life gave her another, an extension, another lease. And so, I think she's just always, once again, coming to unpeel another layer of living.
I'm seeing Yasmin in the chat, if you may wish to jump in. Go ahead, Yasmin.
Thank you. I was a very nervous speaker, and maybe I was hoping you would miss that.
I'm so happy that you're here with us.
I had a thought. There was a question about how we may have come to Audre, and I remember, like, most people come across these little quotes, that people borrow from people to kind of give a punch to what they're saying, grab your attention. That's how I was first kind of familiar with Audre Lorde. But I didn't know Audre Lorde. You don't know, and you just know, oh yeah, that person's writing is really, really like awesome. That's really great. And it wasn't until I was visiting with one of my friends, just hanging out at her place, that it's kind of what I do when I'm hanging out sometimes, is like I walk around and look at the new thing that might be on my friend's wall, or on my friend's shelf. And so looking, through the books on her shelf, I was like, oh, I haven't seen this one before. It's probably always been there. But, I pull it out and it's zombie, and I go, oh, I read the cover and I'm like, okay, hey, can I borrow this? And she's like, oh yeah, that's really, really cool. Yeah, you should totally take that. It took me a long time to get through it. It's kind of, it's a painful read because it is so honest, and just exposes everything, And I think what made it so hard for me to read, what took so long, is because of all the emotions that were being pulled out.
Mhm.
Like you can't really understand something that layered without being willing to examine your own interior life and emotions. And it was so, I'm getting emotional just remembering it right now, I just remember thinking, oh my goodness. And connecting with that, with that suffering, with that beauty, with that love, and feeling like I didn't quite know what to do with it. When you find something and it's just, you don't quite know how to manage it. I'm a person who loves to manage emotions. So this was kind of hard. I couldn't manage it. And I had to talk about it. And so that's my introduction to Audre Lorde. And I thought, wow, okay. So anytime I'm trying to approach a book of that caliber, writing of that caliber, I really have to bring up that courage to examine myself, because I can't fully appreciate what I'm looking at, otherwise. So yeah, I was really interested in hearing what y'all's experience was, and I was just like, wow, I'm so just grateful and a bit overwhelmed emotionally, and so happy that you guys had that experience together. We're able to create the community, with one another and around your group to fully like delve in and appreciate, and also discover yourselves and each other while you do all of that work. So that was really, really cool. And as far as book clubs, book readings go, yeah, that never works out. I find I'm currently in a book group of 2 people.
Hey.
It's working out. I'm one of the 2 people. So, just how small it is, And it's just, it's really lovely. It's lovely to find somebody that you feel a certain trust with, or can create a trust with, that allows true exploration of good literature, in a way that isn't about academia or academics. That's very intimate and personal. So yeah, I'm gonna check out that link. Thank you.
Yes, Mia, that was incredibly powerful. Thank you for sharing that. I'm loving I'm loving everything in the chat. I'm seeing Gio, who's calling in from Mexico. There are some Lorde poems that she wrote for reading in group, like Need, a Choral for Black Women Voices, that's painful but a great learning experience because it discusses Black women's murders. She meant for this poem to be a bridge to dialogue. Rian is also including a reflection I had about Audre Lorde this year is when I watched a documentary about her later years in Germany. There was audio of her talking about being brave, and that really resonated with me. As a Black dyke, I really took that and decided to commit this year to being brave, sitting in uncomfortability, speaking up for myself and those around me. And I see you, Jillian.
Yeah, I was thinking about this theme of urgency and illness, and also just thinking about like what 2020 has been for many of us. And early into the time that the pandemic like arrived in New York, I was like in the first wave of people who got sick. I got sick pretty early, and it was like incredibly scary for me. For like many reasons, right? Like just the lack of knowledge that we all had about how to navigate these things. And yeah, just like very terrifying being in New York, like listening to sirens constantly, and then also being sick yourself and knowing that like the hospital is not an option. All of these things. And I read a lot of Audre, like alone in my room to myself. And I'm a person that has chronic health issues. And so like this idea of like my relationship to my own health and my relationship to illness is like complex and pre-existed before COVID. But in this, like in that early time, I was so struck by the way like so many people suddenly had an urgency about living, and this like energy around the pandemic of like, we're gonna do all of these things. We're gonna like, I'm finally gonna get the life that I always like wanted to have somehow, like during a pandemic. And, you know, I think that's like a stress response. I think that's like a response to capitalism. I think a lot of things about that. But I think like what I was reflecting on and like engaging with Audre and like just being in conversation with myself, because I also really didn't want to be in conversation with others during that period of time, was just like, there's like a frantic urgency of like external pressure, and then there's like an urgency that comes with clarity. And I feel like what Audre had was like clarity. And I feel like she talked about that a lot, where she was like, I have a thing that I have to do because it's like inside of me, and to like do myself justice is to like birth this thing into the world, which is like very different than like, I have to do something because everything around me is pressuring me to do this. And if I don't do it, then I'm a failure. And yeah, I mean, I don't really have like a real thesis around that, but it just was like something that like I thought about a lot, and something that I journaled about a lot, which was just like, our time has always been limited. Our time has always been uncertain. Like our time has always been precious. And like, what is the thing or things that I want to like birth into the world to do myself justice? Yeah, and I've enjoyed continuing to reflect on that.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Jillian. And I want to echo what Yasmin said in the chat. I'm glad that you're in better health now too. I'm seeing Julian, if you'd like to share some thoughts.
Thank you for the opportunity. And I was not a participant in this reading group, but it's been really special to hear the wonderful experience that you all had. It sounds therapeutic for so many of you in so many different ways. And it's special to be able to have something therapeutic happen in community. The reflections that you all had today got me thinking of a Baldwin quote. To be Black and conscious is to be in a constant state of rage. I was wondering, for the people who were a part of the group, as you're uncovering the kind of the dynamism of Lorde, and as Lorde is teaching you about yourself and about the world, did it facilitate moments of rage for you as you compared those lessons to the external world? And I'm interested in your reflections on what that might have been like and how you dealt with it and how you're currently dealing with having the now knowledge and awareness of Lorde in the context of now, you know, understanding a world that for the most part doesn't have Lorde. So I'm wondering if anyone who was a part of the reading group might be able to reflect on that.
I'm so grateful for that question, because it invites a part of the reading group that maybe we hadn't gotten to share enough, which was some moments of outrage about the subject matter that we were talking about, and about people's experiences coming into the reading group every week. Outrage at their jobs, outrage about daily acts of violence, outrage about months, years, centuries of this weight that Audre was trying to bring clarity around. And I wonder if anyone would like to share about that from the reading group that Julian had asked, where rage came into our reflections, thinking about reading Audre Lorde into this present moment.
I can just quickly share something. Like, I think maybe it was our third or our fourth time together. We went to some very intense places. We went to some very, very intense places, and some really uncomfortable places too. Some places that really like pushed at our edges. And you know, there were also, I think, like, it's important to name that there were like varying levels of connection happening between us in the group. So there's like a large group, and then yeah, just different levels of connection. And so there were definitely moments where we were not speaking the same language to each other, or we were missing each other. And so I just say that to say, I don't want to like portray this as though like we did not encounter any of those very human things. Like, that absolutely did happen. And it is like a smaller group of people that continue to be in relationship with each other. But we spent a lot of time, I think. I mean, just like, because we started every session with like a 30-minute at least check-in about where we were coming from that day and also that week, and that, you know, just like there was just a lot of emotion that came into the space. And something that stood out to me was like a lot of the Black women and femmes in the space talking about the ways that we had an extra burden to manage our anger, and the weight of that even in that space, sometimes trying to get our points across in a way that could be accessible to others and could be, you know, particularly as we were still getting to know each other, right? Like, just this trope of the angry Black woman, at the same time that like we can, you know, talk about uses of anger, and we can, you know, appreciate Lorde. Like, do you appreciate that anger when it is like confronting you? Do you appreciate that anger when it is like sharing a space with you and like asking you to be accountable, or asking you to step up and show up and do more? How do you regard anger then? And those were, I don't know how to encapsulate that. I don't know how to like really share it back, but I'll say that like those were moments where I felt very seen, and I felt very connected to the other people in this space, of just being able to like look at someone who who shares Blackness with me, you know, to be able to look at another person who shares Blackness with me and just like recognize that fury. And to have that be a place where we could meet each other also with tenderness, if that makes sense. There's rage and there's anger and there's frustration, and there's also such great tenderness and like someone making space for you to let that out, and to receive it in its fullness and not to reduce it to something that pathologizes you.
Absolutely. I'm curious if there are reflections around this rage and presence and holding the space for that others in the group would want to share about. Nema or T or Joy or Suzanne.
You don't mind, sir? Can you hear me?
Yeah, would you like to jump in?
Yeah,
Sure.
because I'm actually like, I saw in my email that I was a part of this conversation. So this is like the conversation to express about how you're experiencing in this world right now, the conditions right now. What I'm gonna like give you courage to you all is like wherever you go, and just realize it, like as time go on, like as we grow up, just know that you have made that mark, and just don't overdo it. And I myself, I just recognize that, every day is a great day. Anytime you wake up in the morning and all the way to another days, it's not over. And I can see in everyone's face right now, everyone looks like this. But I'm gonna tell you like this, you're unless you're like 90, 80 something years old, but I'm gonna tell you like this, you are still young, and even when you're 60 years old, you still got a way more time. So that does not mean anything you do in this world is not a failure when you're alive. Every day is a great day. Never fluctuate.
Thank you for bringing that in. And I really want to honor that this is definitely an intergenerational gathering that has brought us together tonight around Audre Lorde. And exactly as the last person who had spoken, that we are here together. We are here and we're alive, thinking about Audre and thinking about surviving and being outraged, and also finding ways how to thrive and hold tenderness with each other. And really want to invite, if there are additional reflections or questions that people may have. Maybe there's some on the call who had encountered Audre Lorde in person, seeing her at a reading or in a classroom, perhaps at a demonstration or in a coalition meeting, or if there are any reflections that people may want to share. And feel free to use the chat as folks have been doing. Also, feel free to jump on the mic if folks would like to be able to hear from some more people before we ease out for the night. And don't be shy, we're holding space together. I'm seeing Violetta.
I could answer. Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say I could answer Julian's question about.
Please do.
So you want to know how anger was coming up for us, right? Did it facilitate feelings of rage?
Yeah, I think that's right. But it's not just the anger, it's the increasing distance between your knowledge and the way that the world works, right? So when you become educated on something kind of so fundamentally true as Lorde, it gives you, I don't know, maybe a little bit of a superpower to be able to understand the world better. But with it comes a realization of all the folks that don't have that knowledge, or don't have that ability because it hasn't been unlocked or because it's been suppressed or oppressed. I'm just trying to figure out if there's a word to associate with that experience of that now increasing distance you have because you've gone on an educational journey, and whether that causes any discord or anything that becomes tricky to overcome, even though you've participated in this rejuvenating process, if that makes any sense.
It does. And I really, I'm going to take us back to the text. So in the uses of the erotic, Audre Lorde really speaks, I think, a little bit to what you're saying. I'm going to read two spots I pulled. So the first one, the erotic is not a question only of what we do. It is a question of how acutely and fully we can feel in the doing. Once we know the extent to which we are capable of feeling that sense of satisfaction and completion, we can then observe which of our various life endeavors bring us closest to that fullness. And also, the dichotomy between the spiritual and the political is also false, resulting from an incomplete attention to our erotic knowledge. For the bridge which connects them is formed by the erotic, the sensual, those physical, emotional, and psychic expressions of what is deepest and strongest and richest within each of us being shared. The passions of love in its deepest meanings. And I think for me, there is a serious amount of dissonance. And I do think the dissonance is dissipating more through this year of COVID and like all of the things that have been going on in the protests, because it's harder to the distance between the way that I see the world and the way the world is reflected back to me is getting smaller, right? Like the world looks more like what I believe it to be true. And I think it's harder to say that we don't have, like, white supremacy isn't pernicious and embedded in all of our interactions, that heteronormativity isn't everywhere, that ableism isn't everywhere. I think it's harder to negate any of those things. But what Audre says is that, when you move from an intellectual understanding of what is true to a more embodied understanding of what is true, you are no longer participating in self-abnegation. I'm no longer alienating myself from my body and the way that I see the world. So while I'm like simultaneously maybe more upset, I am much more free than I was before. And in that freedom, I can work on the projects that I care about, right? And the projects that I care about are kinship, community, joy, and like communal pursuit of liberation. Simultaneously enraging, but oh my God, the expansiveness, the richness it feels to see clearly in community mirrored back to me and this group of people. And honestly, that third meeting Julie was talking about was brutal. We really were like, people were just, it was so tense, but it was so powerful because Coco and Jillian did a great job of gathering us all. But it's powerful to say, what is it that you mean? What is it that you are saying? What is it grounded in? And what are you trying to offer to me? And what do you want me to give you? And if you don't know what those questions really are, I don't know how I can keep working in community with you in a principled way. That's a roundabout way, but I hope I answered your question, Julian.
Thank you, Nema. We're holding space. What's coming up in the silence? Maybe if we can get to hear from a couple more of the participants who had shared at the beginning, any concluding reflections they all may have, perhaps even how to think about reading and acting upon Lorde's legacy in this present moment, the pandemic, social uprisings against police violence, how Lorde encourages us to think outside and also in here in our relationships to each other and ourselves. I wonder if there are any final reflections from the participants of the reading group.
Well, I think this has come out in what several people have said, but I think that I mean, maybe our initial readings of the group like didn't bring out some of the more difficult moments and like how, I mean, it was the end of the day for everyone. And then also, being in this space together, it was a very like physically kind of weird setup. And, there was a lot of labor, like emotional labor that went into keeping that space intact. And that is also a huge part of the work. I mean, I think the way Coco and Jillian and also just everyone in the group by the end, or like a lot of people in the group by the end were kind of modeling different registers of care and attentiveness. Yes, like bringing yourself, but also really thinking about how you're bringing yourself and learning, like observing and being like, okay, there's like different ways to show up and different ways to be receptive. And, the idea of illness and disabilities come up several times. And I just, even I think Coco has this like kaleidoscopic little repertoire of like micro care that comes up. And so when the group continued, it was hard to find. There was a lot of, I think, like love and desire to keep going, but then the logistics, like holding logistics was it's just a lot. And so it was like where and when, and then like do we make a spreadsheet of when everybody can meet? Like it took a while. And there were times when we finally kind of had a schedule and people were really not feeling so well, like physically overwhelmed, work overwhelmed. And so just Coco was like offering like, well, let's just have people call in on a phone. And some of us would be like gathered on the sofas in like a student lounge somewhere. And then somebody would be like calling in on a phone. And I remember when, I was dealing with some health stuff, calling in and just feeling like the generosity of that. Of just like hearing you all and being like, you're really letting me call in on I mean, now we're in Zoom, there's like all this capacity for like, oh, apparently everyone could have been calling in all along. There's a lot of stuff around disability, I think, that's coming up in this time. Like there's the idea of accommodation is really changing. And, all of these things that people thought like would never be able to do, like, oh, well, it turns out if it's like profitable to do them, you can just make the switch overnight. But just, there were just these very small kinds of care. And that was just really sustaining. I remember feeling like very not well and hearing your all voices through my phone, in my bed and knowing I just couldn't physically make it that time. And so I think there are so many different forms of that, but I think those registers really came out and those kinds of dedications of care came out.
Thank you, Suzanne. I'm curious, T, Jilly, or Joy, if y'all would like to share any final thoughts.
I'm just looking at this section as we're talking about a couple things that came up where we're talking about anger. And the anger, I don't know, I'm from where I experienced it, because I think there was maybe one moment where we were all sitting at the table and something was said that, we kind of exchanged ideas, and there was some, I don't know how else to call it, for lack of a better word, disagreement on a point. And so it was amazing for me that I think Jillian said that there were different ways in which folks were connecting in the space. So we had the bigger table, but then there were also smaller breakout groups. And then, you know, you got up for snacks, you met at the bathroom or whatever, walking through that maze. The anger of the work, the piece, Ms. Audre's writing, and then kind of the emotional exchange sometimes that could be taxing. It was amazing for me that these things at times would be happening, but then we would be in our own groups and some of us would not be aware of it until we actually came back together as a larger group. And then the subjects, you know, came up during the bigger talk. And so I found this section and I just was looking at it, and again, the part where smeared with my notes and all this kind of stuff. Acting like an insider and feeling like the outsider, preserving our self-rejection as Black women at the same time as we're getting over, we think. And political work will not save our souls, no matter how correct and necessary that work is. Yet it is true that without political work, we cannot hope to survive long enough to affect any change. And self-empowerment is the most deeply political work there is, and the most difficult. And so I wonder if at times our conversations, which were very emotional, which were very raw at times, but then other times were also very political, if in the anger and in the reading about death and these things surrounding death and sickness, was there actual joy happening? Where you see, again, you know, Audre Lorde is still sick and still slowly starting to change, her body wasting away, but you see her in the boat and in the in always at the center of students talking, laughing. So a lot of things came up with the anger involved, but there was such joy in it that just, I don't know, by the end, I don't want to diminish the emotions of the discussion and the talk surrounding that, but it's almost like it had to happen so that we could move to this other space. That conversation had to happen so that when we come back next week and we can continue on with it. Not necessarily just political or emotional, but for whatever was to come, that part had to happen. I don't know if that's making any sense.
Absolutely. And coming towards the end, I'm curious if
you got it so far. Don't be afraid of what you say. Matter of fact, anyone that's speaking, do not be afraid of what you have to say that's coming out of your mind. Just construct what you have to say and just breathe and let it out. That's part of your dopamine.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really important reminder when we live in a society that presses on our chests and doesn't even want for some of us in particular, Black and brown and Indigenous folks, to breathe. That's a very important reminder. I'm looking towards the end of the time, and I see Joy and Jillian, if you may want to have the last words, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead, Joy.
Yeah, if that's okay, I'll let Jillian have the last word. And I just wanted to say thanks, David, for that call. Mm-hmm. And I also just wanted to
you're welcome.
Lightly answer Tracy's question. I don't recall in our group whether anyone saying that they were a cancer survivor, but I think it's a great question, and it reminds me of when we read Zami and how when she spent time in Cuernavaca in Mexico, and she falls into a relationship with this woman. I believe her name is Eudora. I can't remember. Someone can correct me, but it's an older woman, and she had a mastectomy, and they make love, and she talks about that. And so then, to go forward in, when she had her own mastectomy, I think it just sort of, for me, brings it back to like, this body will eventually be a corpse. And so, how can I like Audre, just, live with courage and say the things that I need to say. So yeah, thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Joy, for looping back to Tracy's question. And Jilly, not to put you on the spot, but if you had any final thoughts.
Yeah, I had seen earlier that there was like a question about how we selected people, and I truthfully cannot fully, I remember that there was an application that T talked about, and Coco and I really read through everything, and for sure there are people who like didn't put too much intention into it, and folks who revealed in what they wrote that they were looking for things that actually weren't really about Audre Lorde or weren't really about what we were doing. And so I remember that was part of the process. But I guess something that it made me reflect on actually is that like we didn't know what would come out of it. Like we still didn't know who everyone was. Like we did a scan because there were like, we had X number of books available to us. We felt like we could facilitate an intimate conversation with X number of people. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, there were really actually just kind of logistical things that guided a lot of that. And I do think that like the heart that we put into the call created a really great group of people that responded. And also I think that like when I think about folks starting their own reading groups or, you know, struggling to find people to connect with around this, it's for me, what has been helpful is to release some expectation around what it's really, really, really going to look like. And to start small. So like we actually only met 4 times. Like it was like 1 month, 4 times. And then it happened. It just like, it clicked that like people wanted to keep going together. And so we went little by little. It was like, let's read this other book. And then it was like, let's read these poems. Let's read this, like it was emergent. And I think like I've had a lot of success around that emergence and that kind of like, I'm not asking you to commit to like War and Peace with me, but like, will you read this like smaller thing, or do you want to watch this smaller thing with me, you know? And to just like have heart with it, right? To like really describe to people what is the experience that you're hoping to have around it. And I think that like that honesty and that being forthright in that way, people know how to meet you. People know how to answer that call. And no, it doesn't always work out, but like your success rate, I find starts to go up, and to open your mind to like who it could be too, right? Like we put a random call out on the internet. Like I didn't know these people. So yeah, I hope that is helpful in some way.
Absolutely. And I'm in sharing the materials that we had discussed together, this is really an invitation for everyone who's tuning in or for people who may watch this recording afterwards to start your own Audre Lorde reading group and to read Audre alongside other people who are in this enmeshed legacy of liberation and care that we've gotten to hear from folks tonight. I'm really excited that the next event that will be part of this residency will be continuing on the legacy of Audre Lorde, but through the realm of translation. And someone who is here tonight, Gio Viviella, will be speaking alongside friends who will be calling in from Mexico, from Cuba, from Germany, from here in Canarsie and Lenape territory in Brooklyn on the theme of translating Audre Lorde now. And that will be on November 30th if people are wanting to join us again for that. But just wanting to share again, incredible gratitude for this conversation and for the participants for sharing these reflections about our time together and the ongoing process. Also want to share gratitude to Wendy Subway for helping to put on this event tonight. I encourage folks to stay connected with each other, stay connected with Wendy Subway, and there's some recordings of the previous events for this residency on Wendy Subway's YouTube channel, if you're interested in checking out as well. But for now, I encourage you all, this is a long road and we can carry Audre's lessons along with us. So I hope that you're taking care and staying healthy and continuing the work that was part of her dreams and her life. So thank you all. Sending much love.
Thank you, everyone, so much.
Good night, everyone.
Great night, everyone. Thank you so much for making me speak.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
Everyone done a great job. Keep that energy.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank y'all.
All right.
Good night. Oh, that was so powerful.
That was very special.
Oh my goodness.
I'm so glad there's
Really great. I really just want to thank you all. Just terrific.
Thank you, Blanche. Thank you so much for calling in.
Yeah, we'll keep in touch. And I'm here at Mount Sinai Hospital, and the nurses want to get the link, and I'm going to send it to them.
Yeah, I'll drop the YouTube link right now in the chat. So it's
would you do that, Wendy? I didn't know. And thank you for sending it.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's
I
great.
hope that you have a speedy and full recovery, Blanche. Please stay connected.
Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you. It's just a knee replacement.
Okay.
Moving on.
Moving on.
Gotta kick some Republican ass. Take care.
You too. Much love.
Love.
Okay. All right, I'm going to sign off. Good night. Everyone take care. Thank you again, Sunny. See you soon.
All right, how do I stop this?
Yeah, I think you can just stop. Like, I think at the bottom, there's a button.
Oh, the resume?
Yeah, or on this end. Yeah, and I think you stop it. I think something important when you stop it, let me find, I have a tab open too. I asked them to do this thing where you, I don't know how it goes. Well, let's do resume. And then I think there's stop. Oh no. Well, here, I'm just going to export it.
Yeah.
Here, now it's processing. Because there's this thing where you want, here. Yeah, we want to check that we don't want to use the process transcript.
Should we end the call so it's not on YouTube? But should we end the call so it's not on YouTube?
Yeah, I'm at it. It's fine if it's at the end. I'm going to download it as a Word doc and I'm going to end this call. But everything's good. We're good to go.
Cool.
Thanks so much for your help, Carlos.
Yeah, no problem.
See you soon.
All right. Good night.
Night.